Elector of Bavaria, sent the writings all around the world so the rest of the governments could be aware of the Illuminati's plan to rule the whole world. Now, the English translation of the documents detailing their scheme for world conquest is entitled The Original Writings of the Order and Sect of the Illuminati, and it was put out in the year 1787 by the Elector of Bavaria. Now, that French Revolution came off just exactly as planned, even though the date 1789 was forecast in the planning book and really should have served as a warning. Now, one of the primary tricks in the execution of the overthrow of France was propaganda lies. A rumor was spread that King Louis the 16th and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were guilty of heinous atrocities, and that the Bastille prison was packed with people who were suffering for little or no reason under the harsh rule of King Louis's House of Bourbon. In actuality, King Louis had put a stop to the letters of arrest that his forefathers had used, and instituted many reforms to make life better for his people. He had outlawed torture and servitude, and he repealed all the taxes on wheat, allowed non-Catholic religions to be practiced, and made some sweeping reforms in prisons and in hospitals. Now, he even requested grievances called cahiers from throughout the country in order to identify the problems and needs of the people so that he could be more effective in solving them. So when fans of La 89 sing the praises, these were the best of times and the worst of times, the best of times were those reforms instituted by King Louis XVI, and the worst of times was brought on by the Illuminati front organization called the Jacobans Club. Now, Adam Weishaupt enjoyed the title Patriarch of the Jacobins. You know, their slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity, brought none of that. Only social engineering designed to keep people in and under control. This evil French Revolution was led by Voltaire, Robespierre, Gabriel Racquet, Comte de Mirabeau, Montagnard, Ribald de Mons, Saint-Just, and I can't forget Danton and Marat. And it was also Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans. Now, the Duke of Orleans was the cousin to the king, and there were also some Nordic Illuminists there. And it was Lord Acton who accurately summed the situation in his statement when he said, and I quote, "The appalling thing in the French Revolution is not the tumult, but the design. The design that is apparent throughout the revolution is Adam Weishaupt's plan to destroy all religion, overthrow all governments, and rule the world." Now, the Duke of Orleans lusted to be crowned king, and Illuminati magnate Mirabeau led him to believe that all their efforts were being directed to that end. Now, the Duke of Orleans had himself hailed as the idol of Paris. But the people didn't see how this same insolent tyrant could suddenly become the champion of liberty. This vain and dissolute duke hated King Louis for not making him an admiral in the Navy, and he hated the Queen for interfering with his daughter's marriage to the Duke of Enghien. Now, the Duke of Orleans was also the master of all Grand Orient lodges and Freemasonry, and as such, he possessed a vast network for communications, espionage, and propaganda. And from the largesse of his vault, the Duke started buying up grain hoards and helped finance the importation of 3,000 brigands from southern France and Italy. They were called Marseillais, that spoke a strange tongue, carried heavy knotted sticks, and possessed a real penchant for blood and booty. They came to conquer and plunder France, and in all the major incidences, they comprised the mainstay of the mob. The siege on the Bastille, the march on Versailles, the invasion of Tuileries, the September massacres, and the Reign of Terror. Now, Edmund Burke, who wrote, while reflecting on the tragedy of the French Revolution, said, "It appears to me as if I were in a great crisis, not of the affairs of France alone, but of all of Europe, and perhaps more than Europe." Burke was perceptive. The anarchist Prince Kropotkin stated in 1908 that, and I'm going to quote him, "What we learn today from the study of the Great Revolution is that it was the source and origin of all the prevalent communist, anarchist, and socialist conceptions. Up till now, modern socialism has added absolutely nothing to the ideas that were circulating among the French people between 1789 and 1794, and which it tried to put into practice in the year 2 of the Republic. Modern socialism has only systemized those ideas and found arguments in their favor." In 1789, only 6% of France's revenue was budgeted for the expense of the king's court. The diplomatic corps and the military consumed 25%. The largest portion, nearly 50%, went to pay the interest on the national debt. And approximately 2/3 of that debt was incurred by supporting the American Revolution against King George III of Britain. It doesn't pay to get indebted to bankers. Even though the bankers wanted the American Revolution, they had merely loaned the money to the King of France so that he could underwrite the war for them. He spent it so they had their money accomplish a desired goal, but the principal to be returned and interest added. Now, some would dismiss King Louis's support of the American Revolution as helping an enemy's enemy. But the fact is that it was King Louis and not the Jacobans who made a positive difference in America's revolution being successful. The mob of La Revolution 89 was whipped to frenzy by the rhetoric of the Jacobans through lying to them about the king. The conspirators contended the king was responsible for grain shortages and that he had killed the deputies of the assembly at Versailles, imprisoned the Duke of Orleans, and had the royal army marching on Paris to attack the citizenry. But the truth of the matter was, it was really the Duke of Orleans that had hoarded the grain. So when the mob stormed the Bastille prison on July 14th, 1789, they found it nearly empty of prisoners, not packed like they were told. There were precisely 7, including a nobleman whose family had him incarcerated for monstrous cruelty, the Count de Sologis, and his family was not pleased with his return. 4 of them were forgers, named Béchade, Lacourage, Puget, and Laroche. 2 others, Tavernier and DeWitt, were insane. Now, the Bastille prison was a depository of firearms for the king, and this was the reason that the Jacobins led the mob there, for arms, to overthrow the king. King Loney, the commander of the fortress, honored the king's orders not to fire on the citizenry, and he was killed by the mob there as a result. His soldiers were also killed. Affluent citizens were arrested on the following August 29th. In the 3 days, 6,000 people were imprisoned. All the monks in one abbey were murdered. After the murders were each paid 24 francs. Then they went to the Convent de Cames, where 200 priests were locked up. And within 90 minutes, 119 of them were savagely butchered. While the slaughter took place within the monastery, the new national police surrounded the building to guard the executioners from the people. The carnage was wanton, with indiscriminate killings of guards, monks, priests, servants, ladies in waiting, peasants, and innocents of many kinds under the new Minister of Justice, Danton. The fall of Tuileries, which was on August 10th of 1792, brought on a real frenzy. Everything was pillaged and destroyed, including art and jewels. Thousands of bottles of wine from the king's cellar precipitated a drunken orgy. The palace's Swiss guards were grilled and eaten. Some drank human blood. This bloody revolution took the lives of 300,000 men, women, and children. Less than 2,500 were nobility. The Jacobin executioner, Jean-Baptiste Carrier, particularly delighted in the destruction of children. And he gave an order to butcher nearly 500 young children at Nantes. It's unimaginable that they drove the children into a field and shot, clubbed, and skewered them with sabers while the babes cried for mercy. He hated the whelps. He found the guillotine and the gun were way too slow to really suit him, so he... Welcome back. This is Jack Otto. This is July the 14th, 2007, and we're talking about a July 14th back in 1789 when the Illuminati led people to break into the Bastille prison, pretending it was overrun with innocent people being housed there under harsh rule of King Louis's House of Bourbon. But the truth of the matter was they wanted guns to overthrow the king. And that was the depository of arms. And once they had the bit in their teeth, they killed men, women, and children, ladies in waiting, and poor people alike. And we were just mentioning about Jean-Baptiste Carrier, the Jacobin executioner, who particularly delighted in the destruction of children and had them drowned in the Loire and Rhone rivers. And it's my contention that the delight in the destruction of children can be justified only in the deranged minds of devout Satanists. Now, shortly after that coup was completed, this Illuminati conspirators brought out one of their very favorite tools. It was inflation. Now, because air and water are plentiful, the price is low despite our vital need for these commodities. Gold and diamonds are not so vital, but very expensive because of their scarcity. And money, like everything else, has its value determined by scarcity more than essentialness. Now, when government or its banksters pump up the money supply with more paper notes, the dollars are worth less. And consequently, it takes more of them to buy everything. Inflation has historically been defined as an increase of the currency in circulation. And a symptom of that is price increases. Let me recapitulate on that one more time. I want to recap that again because it's important. Inflation has historically been defined as an increase in the currency in circulation. And a symptom of that is price increases. Now the propaganda mills, your television and newspaper, etc., would have us believe that price increases are inflation. And no one really knows the cause. Sometimes it's drought in the swamps or greedy Arabs are blamed, anything and everything but Big Brother printing more money. Now, at the time of the French Revolution, Christianity was outlawed due to an illuminated Prussian baron named Anacharsis Cloots, who was a Rothschild agent tour. And the property of the churches was pledged as backing for the new currency called essence. And immediately the printing presses began to roll. And those who printed money were able to buy up more of France than those who had to work for their money. This progressed so quickly that in a couple of years the money was worthless and depression plagued all the land. But the big bankers were set to finance the Napoleonic War and bring socialism to Europe. Now, each of these conspirators was in turn to meet the measure they prescribed to others on a wholesale level. The Duke of Orleans was surprised that he got the guillotine instead of the monarchy. Now, Marat was deformed and ugly, and he allegedly proved his satanic link by rotting very quickly after he was killed. He was stabbed in the heart by a young woman. Her name was Marie Charlotte Corday. She sneaked into his bath and found him in a tub with a cloth over his face while he rested, and that brutal beast was dispatched by the young lady. Now, near the end, the ringleader, Augustin Robespierre, decided to commit suicide, but succeeded only in blowing off his jaw. And as he lay bleeding on a table used to plan the blood of others, a workman noticed him there and exclaimed, "There is a God." And it is rumored that at the guillotine, the executioner tore off his bandages and the jaw nearly fell off. Robespierre groaned in agony so loudly that he could be heard throughout the square. And when his decapitated head was presented to the audience, cheers erupted. Everyone proclaimed that the reign of terror was over. It was only modified. A fresh new front was erected every few years. Even King Louis XVIII was installed for a few years, but there was always a power behind the throne. France is still under the control of these pseudo-Jews. Even Napoleon III was their man that ruled from 1852 to 1870. Napoleon Bonaparte III was not related to Napoleon, the Emperor of France, by blood. He was the bastard son of a Rothschild. See, the Emperor's stepdaughter, Hortensia, had some financial difficulties and turned to Rothschild for her loans. Nathan Rothschild fathered a son by her that was a striking likeness of his own self. Usually the insiders fill important positions with their bastard children like this Napoleon III. So in the year 1798, John T. Robison was the professor of natural philosophy at the University of Edinburgh and Secretary General to Scotland's Royal Society. I hear break music coming up. I'm going to tell you about John Robison and his natural philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome back from the short break. We were talking about Professor John T. Robison, who in 1798 was the professor of natural philosophy at the University of Edinburgh and the Secretary General to Scotland's Royal Society. He was the quintessential scientist of his era, with great understanding in many sciences and arts. And it was this Professor Robison who published a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy. Does that make him a conspiracy theorist? I guess not when you got proof. There's more than theory here. See, now this Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, at least the Bavarian branch of the Illuminati, had invited Professor Robison to join the insiders, but Robison only feigned interest in order to gain more information about the conspirators' plans. Professor Robison wrote, and I quote, "I have been able to trace these attempts made through a course of 50 years under the specious pretext of enlightening the world by the torch of philosophy and of dispelling the clouds of civil and religious superstition which keeps the nations of Europe in darkness and slavery. I have observed these doctrines gradually diffusing and mixing with all the other different systems of Freemasonry till at last an association has been formed for the express purpose of rooting out all the religious establishments and overturning the existing governments of Europe. And I have seen this association exerting itself zealously and systematically till it has become almost irresistible. And lastly, I have seen that this association still exists, still works in secret. Next year, in 1799, a French monk, the Abbé Augustin Barriel, published a 4-volume treatise on the very same subject that was entitled Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism. And now, it was never translated into English until very recently. In it, he remarked, and I'm going to quote, "The sect made many adepts in Russia who had taught to scoff at oaths. They only took the oaths of fidelity to the monarchy that they might more easily annihilate the Russian diadem. The conspirators were headed by Gannett, hitherto the agent for the cabinet of Versailles, but had now become the agent for the Jacobins." Now, Reverend Jedi Morse was a Boston pastor and father of Samuel Morse, the guy that invented the code for the telegraph. And he worked diligently to expose and thereby suppress the activities of the Illuminati here in America. In the 1800s, nearly all the educated people were aware of the Illuminati due to the popularity of the book written by the highly respected Professor John Robison. Now, early in 1794, around the western part of Pennsylvania, insurrection was promoted by this Edmund Charles Gannett, the French envoy to America and an Illuminist. His group was known as the Meadow Creek Democratic Society. They tried to bring about succession to create a separate country in what is known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, President Washington put a stop to those plans at a cost of about $1 million, and he publicly denounced the French Illuminists behind it. Historian William P. Hoare commented on the event, and I'm going to quote him. "President Washington believes the revolutionary democratic clubs were responsible for the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. Whatever the case, it was certainly the spirit of the French Revolution that sustained it." On another occasion, he remarked, "The young and independent Republic of the United States had survived subversion by a European conspiracy and now had breathing space in which to recuperate. The disease, however, had not been conquered and would appear again." We would be wise to heed the words of William Cullen Bryant, who said, "Not yet, O freedom, close thy eyes in slumber, for thine enemy never sleeps." And it was Albert Beveridge that comments that when the troops sent out to put down insurrection reached Harrisburg, they found the French flag flying over the courthouse. President Washington said, "I consider this insurrection as the formidable proof of the democratic societies instituted by artful and designing members. I see under a display of popular and fascinating guises the most diabolical attempts to destroy the government." He further declared, quote, "that they have been the fomenters of the Western disturbance admits of no doubt. If the daring and factious spirit is not crushed, adieu to all government in this country except mob and club government." When Gannett was replaced as French envoy, he does not go back to France, but settled in New York to carry on revolutionary treachery. Ambassador Fauché, another Illuminati conspirator, replaced him. Correspondence from Fauché to his government back in France was exposed to reveal that one Edmund Randolph was involved, but Randolph was a member of President George Washington's cabinet, but not for long. See, a growing number of inflammatory journals called for a French Revolution in America, and this is what led to the Alien and Sedition Act as a means to deter that kind of violence. If you plan to conquer the entire world, you must break up the powers that be. And certainly the British Empire was the biggest on the face of the earth and the primary target. That's why Baron Rothschild's bank loaned money to King Louis XVI to help finance the American Revolution. Rothschild aided frontmen like Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton to come into the foray. Rothschild's man, Napoleon, was after the heart of the European empire more directly, and he caused havoc until he met Lord Wellington at Waterloo. Now, this was not a real setback for Rothschild because he had an agent that was monitoring the progress of the war and sent him a message by carrier pigeon to inform him that Napoleon had lost. Now, Nathan Rothschild, then the leader of that dynasty, sold all his British government bonds and spread the false rumor that Napoleon had won and Wellington had lost. Now, those who believed that the British government had lost sold their government bonds for nearly nothing because they knew that a defeated and defunct government would not be able to honor its financial obligations. Now, at the depth of that despair, Rothschild had some of his closest associates start buying up these allegedly worthless securities for less than 1% of their worth. This increased Rothschild's wealth by 21 times, almost overnight. And when the truth about Napoleon's defeat became known, Rothschild disappeared for a little while. He owned enough of Britain to force a reformation of the bank and have his man put in charge of the treasury. This was a springboard from which to influence the British Empire and the formation of rule in France as well. Today, through arranged marriages, Rothschild blood flows in the veins of much of the European aristocracy. The Rothschild clan's desire to aggregate material gain and secure power has turned to inbreeding as a means of concentrating. These financial pharaohs are withering genetically, as did their Egyptian counterparts that waited in the shallow end of the gene pool. Ugly Betty, now that's Salman Rothschild's daughter and his brother Jacob's wife. Yes, it's inbreeding, all right. Has stained their feeble appearances clear to the bone. According to that great historian Eustace Mullins in his text, The World Order, on page 54, he says so clearly, it is stated clearly and succinctly that, and I'm going to quote, "The British Empire has prospered on piracy, slavery, and the drug traffic." See, these Red Shield are the mainstay in that despotism, and they are the royalty that came from the evil Venetian bankers. Some are the Lord President of the Council, Viscount Halsham, Lord Chancellor Baron Moham, Viscount Halifax, Secretary of State for the Dominions, Lord Stanley, and Secretary of State for India and Burma, Marquis of Zutland. Now, the Duke of Windsor and Wallace Warfare share some of this so-called Jewish heritage. And Prince Charles has ties to the Rothschilds themselves through his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who adapted Prince Philip at a young age. Now, Prince Philip, who is the husband to the Queen of England, his real name is Schleswig, Holstein, Sonderburg, Glucksburg. And back when the Illuminati was exposed and Weishaupt had to flee, he went to stay with the Duke of Saxe-Gotha. And that Duke ended up being rewarded with the monarchy. They changed their name to Windsor, but the royal family of Windsor's real name is Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The Rothschild legacy rules today. It started with Meyer Amschel Bauerberg, who adopted the Rothschild name. Now, Junior recognized his brother Nathan's superior financial acumen and passed the mantle on to Nathan, who held the post until his death in 1836. Nathan's eldest son, Lionel Rothschild, then became the managing executive of N.M. Rothschild and Sons. His son, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, succeeded him in 1879 and became the first Lord Rothschild. When he died in 1915, the successor became Lionel Walter Rothschild, who held the reins until his passing in the year 1937. The head of the London office of N.M. Rothschild and Son was then turned over to Meyer Victor Rothschild. He in turn passed the mantle on to Jeroboam Rothschild, who changed his name to George Mandel. Now, there was a guy named Arnold Lease that published a booklet entitled Our Jewish Aristocracy, in which he lists names of British nobility that have, quote, Jewish ancestry. And I would like you to know, we are going to put that word in quotes here because we're not talking about real Jews, but those Khazar warriors who have only pretended to embrace Judaism so that they have a cover to infiltrate and rape and pillage wherever they may feel like. Now, Mr. Lease stated in his foreword that he dealt with the aristocracy because the lineage is recorded and therefore it would be easier for Britons to trace those pedigrees than it would be able to do so among professions, merchants, or trade unions. And we could go through a whole list of these here because everything from the 12th Duke of St. Albans, the 8th Duke of Richmond, I have literally pages of these characters who are the royalty. And then you get down to the baronets and the knights, and those who have married in to these Jewish-sounding families. Now, it's worth repeating that these people have what is commonly accepted to be Jewish-sounding names. This does not give them Semitic genes. That's why I so often embed in quotes the term Jew, so that we are forever reminded that we're discussing so-called and not real Judeans or people from the tribe of Judah. See, that British monarchy fought 10 opium wars with China from 1840 to 1931. The British East India Company opened its very first Far East office in Canton in the year 1715 as a front for the British Crown. Now, policy deliberately fostered opium addiction among the natives to facilitate British political control. There are Chinese Jews called Cao Caio Caio that aided the crown in this opium trafficking. And since those Khazars are originally from the Mongolian race, it was even easier for them to intermingle with the Chinese people than with the Europeans. Now, the British Empire was threatened with the possibility of bankruptcy if it lost the American colonies. And in order to defeat the rebels, profits from the opium trade with China were sent to the Elector of Hesse via Meyer Amschel Bauerberg Rothschild to acquire 16,800 Hessian troops. Thus, the drug traffic in the Rothschilds played a pivotal role in American history, although it has been ignored and pretty much deleted from the history books. Welcome back to Jack Otto. We're finishing up the last part of the first hour here. And we've been discussing the French Revolution that marks the anniversary today of the storming of the Bastille prison. And we see how, in reality, that was a function of and a game plan by the insiders, the Illuminati, to get themselves a foothold. And that was probably the first country that they really had total control over. They went on afterwards to take America. Like we said before, if you want to rule the whole world, you have to break up the powers that be. And certainly the King of England was probably the most powerful man on the face of the earth. They bragged that the sun never set on the British flag. So even though the bankers had some strong influence in European government and agents placed in high places, they had not yet gained a controlling interest in the American colonies. And the colonists issued their own money called colonial scrip, which put them beyond the reach of the bankers. Now, the King of England was indebted to Rothschild because that was the source of his loans and mercenary Hessian soldiers. And the King of England yielded to his banker with respect to forcing the money issue onto the American colonists. The king decreed that all colonial money was to be turned into the Bank of England to be used as collateral to borrow English money. The Bank of England would only allow them half of what the money was worth, and the constriction in money supply caused a severe depression in the economy. Most of the people were unemployed. And as a result, bankers' delight in recession is it allows them to purchase real assets with their paper money at a bargain price. In 1760, King George III let his arrogance run away with him. The American colonies had been allowed to ship products like tobacco and lumber and cotton to England, but nowhere else. Now, those who traded sugar and molasses with the West Indies did so at a risk. And the king decided to shorten everybody's leash. This included prohibiting emigration to the American colonies and marking the best pine trees for his own navy. Now, this act irritated the colonists so much that they went out of their way to harvest the marked trees and used the pine tree as a symbol of rebellion against the king. When the king prohibited the weaving of cloth, the colonial women continued at the looms anyway. Animosity built until the king's men sent out to take away the people's means of defense. And when the soldiers came to confiscate the arms and powder, those embattled farmers stood their ground at Lexington and Concord and fired the shot heard round the world. It was Ben Franklin that commented, and I'm going to quote him, "The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money." We're going to be right back. We got a quick break coming up here. This is the hour break. We'll discuss more of this on the other side. Please listen carefully to our sponsors. We need them. Welcome Welcome back. We were talking about Ben Franklin's comment how the colonies would have borne the tax on tea and other matters had it not been that the king had refused to allow us to have an honest money system. And the refusal of King George to operate on this honest colonial money system that freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the manipulator was probably the prime cause of the revolution. That's a quote from Ben Franklin. Now, it was an understanding of money and the impact that the pernicious expansion and contraction of fiat paper money that caused the Americans to institute safeguards within the Constitution itself. We should note that Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5 says, quote, Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, end of quote. And it should be obviously unconstitutional that we now have paper money instead of coin, and it is worse that our money comes from a private banksters rather than from Congress. Alexander Hamilton pushed for a central bank in America. Rothschild had him expound the virtue of European money on the grounds that it would be more acceptable in trade with European countries than American dollars. This led to the establishment of the Bank of America with $28 million from Europe to help fund and found it in 1791. Rothschild gave easy credit. After the Yanks had mortgaged their property to make investments, this easy credit was constricted. Loans were called in, and the money supply diminished to a point where depression plagued the land. The international banksters delighted in foreclosure on millions in property and security. This was the impetus for Thomas Jefferson to say, quote, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. You too may join this conversation if you wish to call in. The number is 1-800-313-9443. About Thomas Jefferson, who was mentioning that he believed that banking institutions were more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Of course, it's hard to believe that standing armies really are dangerous to liberties. See, the king's armies had served two functions. Number one, you could march them off to foreign countries and conquer them, but it was worse when they stood around at home and run you. The colonists came to resent the function of the king's army because the king would force you to keep some of his soldiers right in your own home. And he allowed them to take liberties, and oftentimes they would steal from the man of the house or rough him up and molest his women folk. And as a consequence, people got disgusted with the notion of standing armies and put that right in the Constitution that we weren't to have them. Well, when Thomas Jefferson said that he believed that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies, and he also mentioned that they raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance, and he said that the issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Well, that kind of rhetoric caused Rothschild to be concerned that the charter for the Bank of America not be renewed when it expired in 1811. And he let it be known that, quote, either the application for renewal of the charter is granted or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. The charter was not renewed, and the War of 1812 commenced, as we were told in history books, because American soldiers were impressed into the service of the king. They were unable to bring America back to the colonial status, but the renewal of that charter for the Bank of America was accomplished at the Treaty of Ghent, at the close of negotiations to settle the War of 1812. And in 1816, America had a central bank again. Now, Rothschild died in 1812 and left a durable trust dedicated to creating world government in, quote, Jewish, end of quote, control. The executor is always to be one of the eldest direct descendants with a absolute total control. The eldest son of the eldest son is the designated lineage unless the majority of the immediate family votes otherwise. Family members are all super rich, but the mainstay of the wealth lies in the trust under solitary control. After Andrew Old Hickory Jackson became president of the United States, he led a crusade against the Banksters and their central bank. He closely paraphrased the words in the Bible when he charged, "You are a den of thieves, vipers. I intend to rout you out. And by the eternal God, I will rout you out." He was the first president to be fired upon by assassins. Now, Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of America and a frontman for James Rothschild of Paris. Biddle claimed that President Jackson's removal of deposits from the bank caused him to call in loans and stop lending. Such tight credit reduced the money in circulation brought on another depression. All was blamed on President Jackson. Banksters contended that the central bank was the cause of prosperity, and Jackson had killed the goose that laid the golden egg. When businessmen clamored for relief, President Andrew Jackson pointed out Biddle's role, and the ruse to embarrass backfired on Biddle. The citizenry realized that if one banker had the power to cause depressions, then President Jackson was right when he said the bank was too powerful. Nicholas Biddle was embarrassed into backing off, and so he started loaning money again. And the return of money brought prosperity back to America, and the Depression dissolved without the bankers in control of American money, but only for a short while. The international bankers made another push into politics by getting August Schoenberg, who passed himself off as Belmont. He was appointed to Abe Lincoln's cabinet. August Belmont Schoenberg was a mover and shaker in the Erlangers, and he became chairman of the Democratic Party for 20 years. Another Rothschild agent tour and a blood relative, one Judah P. Benjamin, was the Secretary of War and later Secretary of State for Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of the South. We've got a break coming up. We're going to be right back, and we'll talk more about the Rothschilds financing both sides of a war. We'll be right back. Please stay tuned. Welcome back. We were talking about the Rothschild influence on both sides of the war of northern aggression, the one that calls itself the Civil War. Now, we know that on the one side, on the side of the Yanks, right in Abe Lincoln's cabinet was a guy by the name of August Schoenberg, who dropped the Schoenberg name and went by the alias Belmont. Now, there was another Rothschild agent and a blood relative, a guy by the name of Judah Benjamin, that was the Secretary of War for Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of the South. And then later he became the Secretary of State and also the head of the Confederate Secret Police. Now, these characters operated from within Simon Wolfe's B'nai Brith that was formed in New York in 1843. That means Sons of the Covenant. And in another secret society founded by Albert Pike, known as the Knights of the Golden Circle. They changed its name to the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War, and their motto became the South shall rise again. So other members of this Knights of the Golden Circle included a guy by the name of Robert Howard, who passed himself off as Jesse James, and John Wilkes Booth, the false Jewish type of assassin that killed President Lincoln for the Jesuits. Now, President Lincoln's Secretary of War, a guy by the name of Edwin Stanton, was secretly the head of the anti-Lincoln faction, and he personally helped Booth escape by sending a captain in the Southern Army along the same route used by Booth in his escape. Co-conspirators were waiting there to murder that look-alike in a barn so Booth would no longer be pursued. Some wondered why the burned body found in the barn showed no break in the ankle where Booth jumped down from the president's box after the shooting. Many theater patrons claimed hearing a definite break when Booth jumped on the stage from Lincoln's box, and he limped out the door. President Abraham Lincoln had a dissension with the international bankers, and he irritated them by printing treasury bills, greenback paper money, instead of allowing the banksters to print debt currency that would be loaned to the U.S. at 28% interest. He was no longer fulfilling his prime directive. He was hindering it. Now, the London Times printed an article in concern about Lincoln's greenbacks, and in that article it said, if this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe. Sounds like a good idea to me. It was President Lincoln that stated after the close of the war, the money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working on the prejudices of the people until wealth is aggregated in the hands of the few and the republic is destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of the war. And he was talking about the Civil War. And this stance caused President Lincoln to lose his life. Even though his real name was Springsteen, and the family passed themselves off as Springs and intermarried with the powerfully occult Todds, Lincoln's conscience got to the best of him, and when it come to betraying all the people all the time, he regretted his alliance with the bankers. In his closing days, President Lincoln lamented government possessing power to create and issue currency and credit as money and enjoying the right to withdraw currency and credit from circulation by taxation and otherwise, need not and should not borrow capital at interest as the means of financing government work and public enterprise. The government should create, issue, and circulate all currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of the government, it is the government's greatest opportunity. So here we are, on the very precipice of destiny. Are we truly free people? Are we the descendants of those who had the guts, the courage, the resolve to throw a king off their back and secure for themselves and their posterity liberty and freedom? Or are we the subjects of an all-powerful superstate that really has the right to tell you what's good for you, to make you swallow some of that doublethink? That's an Orwellian concept where people are asked to swallow absurdities and logic just because the speaker is of power and can cram it down your throat. I want to again mention to you folks that freedom isn't free. And if we're going to keep on doing this, we need your support. Send the Republic Broadcasting Organization something. Try to help keep them afloat. Send it to John Statmiller at 2251 Double Creek Boulevard, Suite 302. That's in Round Rock, Texas, where the zip code is 78664. I think it's important for us to realize how much we have been flim-flammed and manipulated, how we've been kept in the dark so long and fed so much crap that we may very well have become mushrooms. Now, we were talking about this IRS problem here, and one of the very first things that people do when they start filling out the IRS form is they get to one of the very first questions there, right after your name and address. It asks you, are you a U.S. citizen? And if you check off, yes, I am a U.S. citizen, then you have just indicated that you have accepted that 14th Amendment option of you becoming a citizen of the U.S. in addition to one of the states. Prior to that time, you were a citizen of the state that you lived in, a sovereign in this state. But in this form of the 1040, you end up signing down at the bottom under penalty of perjury that that's true and accurate statement, so you have sworn under penalty of perjury that you are a U.S. citizen. I don't think you really want to be. I think you want to be a sovereign of your own state. Somehow we have to get smart. Somehow we have to wake up.